Hello and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us as we discuss planning for sustainability after ESSER. I'm Jasmine Walker, the Senior Manager of OBC Engagement at the Southern Education Foundation. I'm excited to be joined today by Isha Collins, Director of the Equity Assistance Center South, Joseph Trawick-Smith, Partner at Education Resource Strategies, and Hassan Ibrahim, Principal Associate at Education Resource Strategies. Let's dive in. At this time, I'm going to hand it over to Joe.
Great. It's great to be with you all this afternoon. My name is Joe Trawick-Smith, and I'm a partner at Education Resource Strategies, or ERS. I'm joined by my colleague Hassan Ibrahim, who will be talking through some of the big issues that we're tackling this year as ESSER goes away. Hassan, do you want to move it to the next slide? So just a little bit about Education Resource Strategies. We are a nonprofit organization based out of the greater Boston area. And our focus is really working with school system leaders to help them make shifts in resources, structures, and practices so that all students, especially those furthest from opportunity, can thrive. What makes us a little bit unique from many organizations is that our focus is really on the system level, that we don't think you can transform schools one school at a time, that it actually takes really strong systems in order to make that happen. You'll see evidence of that in the way that we're talking about this final year of ESSER, where there are so many system level implications, whether you're a district leader or a state leader. This is not something that we can navigate one school at a time. We actually need to work across systems to figure out what is the path forward as we head into this final year, or we round out this final year of ESSER. So our time today, we're going to be focused on a few things. One, we want to spend a little time just building understanding of the challenges and opportunities for districts in this moment of transition as ESSER funding ends. Each district's challenge is unique, and yet we think that there's a lot of commonality across districts in what they're wrestling with. And it's really important to acknowledge and understand that challenge in order to figure out how do we actually navigate it? How do we move forward? We're going to talk through strategic moves districts can take to sustain the impact of ESSER investments while simultaneously navigating a potential fiscal cliff. A lot of districts are finding themselves in this really, really challenging place right now, where there's a lot of good work that ESSER dollars have gone to fund, and that work needs to continue. And yet they are also bumping up against sometimes pretty sizable financial sustainability challenges. So how do we navigate that? What are some moves that we can make to make the most of this moment? We're going to talk about developing plans to use the upcoming FY25 budget cycle as sort of a launch pad into long-term financial sustainability. For many of you, you are already underway, or some of you may have been closing out the budget season this year. We don't see the sustainability work that lies ahead as just being a one-year challenge, but we do want to start working now, taking steps towards what a more sustainable school system might look like down the road. And then lastly, we'll pause at the end to talk a little bit about some opportunities for support from both ERS and EAC. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague, Hassan.
Thank you so much, Joe, and really excited to have folks here in the Zoom and to be sharing this moment with you all. I know we've got district leaders, state leaders, advocates here, and so appreciate you all taking the time to join us in this conversation. And the chat functionality is on, and so as we go today, I might ask a couple questions, and excited to hear from you all and to help push our thinking as well. I want to start by actually taking us back a couple years and thinking about the situation that district leaders found themselves in the summer of 2021 as that massive influx of ARP funding came in. And district leaders were really struggling to think about, like, what do I do? How do we spend these resources as effectively as we can to both support recovery of the immediate needs to meet the pandemic, but also in long-term redesign to not just get students back to where they were pre-pandemic, but really think about long-term transformation. And so ESSER funds, as they came in, as everyone here knows, reflected a substantial increase on district budgets, particularly in high poverty districts who received the largest influx of ESSER funds. And so district leaders were faced with important decisions about how to meet the moment of keeping schools safe and open and recovering from the pandemic, while also focusing on that deep system redesign to accelerate learning and improve outcomes. And in our work with district leaders over 2021 and 2022, we found a consistent set of guiding principles that district leaders were using when they thought about what ESSER plans should look like. They focused on research proven high impact strategies. They thought about new staffing and scheduling models. They grounded investments in equity, really thinking about how do we target this to those who are furthest from opportunity. They also thought about the system conditions and the processes that needed to change in their systems, about how do we really understand the impact of our investments and align ourselves towards continuous improvement of these initiatives. And so you might sort of see these list of power strategies, and I'm curious for folks in the room who work in districts, or all of us have exposure to them, what strategies you've seen that you're excited to continue to see in districts coming out of these types of power strategies. For example, investments in more time and attention, like high dosage tutoring, or investments in professional development, or investments in high quality instruction materials. So, in the chat, feel free to sound off on those investments that you think are really those high leverage ones that align to these power strategies, and hopefully we're seeing those returns on investments. So feel free to populate those as we go. But for many districts, as they thought about those particular investments on a power strategy, they didn't do so in isolation. They brought in this, what we call this do now, build toward approach, where district leaders were thinking about how do we want to do a high dosage tutoring strategy, and we're going to use our ESSER funds to do so. And we'll, then do that right just after school using a virtual tutoring service. But in the long term, what does it look like to actually embed tutoring within the school day to achieve this build toward vision of more targeted time and attention for students within the school day? Or professional development, where a lot of one-time professional development was paid for with ESSER to cover PD on a new high-quality instructional set of materials. And so, great, we did a bunch of one-time PD, but now what does job-embedded professional development look like in the context beyond ESSER? So we had put out a bunch of these guides building on what we were learning from the field about what are the do now, the one-time investments that systems can be doing that ultimately build toward these longer strategic changes in how schools look. So that is what we saw in 2021, 2022, as systems are really thinking about what are our ESSER plans. And so now, as we transition to the end of the ESSER timeline, district leaders are considering, how do we take that same do now, build toward approach that we took to investments and apply it to thinking about how we sustain impact? How do we take those redesign strategies and keep doing them without seeing a fiscal cliff come? So those strategies like academic supports for teachers of struggling students, or high dosage tutoring, named by Judith and Nick, like how do we actually keep doing that after those ESSER funds ramp down? And so one approach could be that a district could just, in the scenario one here, all the way on the left, just sort of approach sustainability as solving the fiscal challenge. So we're going to avoid a fiscal cliff at all costs, which means that as ESSER funds ramp down, we're ending all recovery and redesign initiatives and going back to our prior to COVID legacy spending amounts. But the challenge there is that then any sort of impact that you're seeing from changes in service delivery also end with that termination of those funding. Scenario two could sort of be the hope and wish strategy, where you say, no, we're doing really great redesign strategies that we don't want to stop doing. And we're just going to sort of hope that we get that additional funding. We make those convincing arguments to see increases in our funding. And then the reality where I think most districts are landing is recognizing that there are redesign strategies that are higher impact on achieving student outcomes than legacy investments might have been. And so how do we actually smooth that transition and find a way to use the ESSER changes to build toward a way of structuring schools differently that allow us to return to pre-COVID spending levels while still keeping the system redesign going? Now, obviously, that last scenario is an aspiration, and there are districts that are all in different stages of making those types of evaluations and comparisons. But when we think about sustainability, I think often we jump to fiscal sustainability as we've got to solve that 10% budget cut. And it's so important in this moment when we see academic recovery just starting to come back. You all might have seen the education recovery scorecard findings from earlier in this week that we are, many states are just sort of making initial incremental recovery, let alone to reaching baseline and ultimately surpassing, with a few exceptions. And so in all of that context, we can't just think about fiscal challenges. We also have to think about these changes to service delivery. Now, it's not easy, and this moment, as the folks in this webinar certainly know, are littered with additional challenges. For example, just the magnitude of the decrease of ESSER in many systems is going to be substantial, particularly in districts with the highest concentration of students experiencing poverty. There's growing skepticism about what exactly did districts do with ESSER funds? We hear a lot about it. We heard about these ARP funds. What have they been used for? And so districts are sort of having to tell the story of all the great things while also figuring out what they want to ramp down and keep doing. And so the challenge of addressing the skepticism while also planning is very tough. And then lastly is this reduction options can be at odds with recovery, as districts are being told we need to make cuts to adjust our budgets to no longer having ESSER while also sustaining all of the things that are working for students. And so this is a unique moment. While districts have had to weather cuts before, it really does seem like there is a lot that is making this unique ESSER moment more challenging than ones we've seen previously. And not to lay on the challenges too much here, but it is also the case that there are the other challenges that districts need to contend with, whether that's declining enrollment in many systems, particularly in large urban districts, or diminished central office capacity. We've seen turnover in central office and district leadership in ways that we haven't seen before, and a whole bunch of the other challenges that you all see here. Would be curious to hear folks in the chat weigh in on this one of what if these challenges resonate with what you're hearing in districts or what you're experiencing yourself? What other challenges are feeling really, really big in this moment? Would love to see a couple responses from folks here. While those come in, let's not dwell on the challenges, and let's think about what are the opportunities to build our understanding of the nature of the sustainability challenge, and think about how we can use this moment in the budget planning timeline and in where districts are at going into this the rest of this school year and the next one to plan accordingly. So what we found is that there are a number of factors that are influencing the nature of the fiscal challenge that districts might be driving toward. Every district received a different level of resources and has a different way that they've used them over the last few months. Over the last few years, that now creates a unique situation, a unique sustainability challenge in every system. So in our work with districts, we've tried to understand from them as they start to do their sustainability planning, what exactly are those factors that are pushing them to think about the nature and the magnitude of their sustainability challenge. So the first one that I want to address is relatively straightforward, of just their ESSER allocation. How much ESSER did they get? Not just as a raw dollar amount, but rather in the context of their baseline revenue. For districts that already sort of had large state and local funding levels, ESSER actually didn't represent as much of a percentage increase. And so while it allowed them to do many things new and differently, it actually, as they now transition off of ESSER, are finding themselves able to stem that gap. Whereas districts receiving generally lower levels of baseline resources, ESSER could have represented as much as a 15, 20 percentage point increase on their baseline budgets. And so now as they think about the level of magnitude that they're ramping down, districts that receive these larger ESSER allocations are certainly going to be experiencing a more acute challenge than ones who ESSER was less of a story for. Important to again note there that it is these districts that received large ESSER allocations that are the districts serving the students furthest from opportunity, students experiencing poverty in the highest proportions, because that's how ESSER was allocated. And so it is especially important in these contexts to be thinking about what are the types of supports that those districts who received large ESSER allocations are going to need? What are the types of planning that they're going to need to do in this current moment? The second factor we've seen are increased teacher salaries. For districts that either used ESSER or used the flexibility that ESSER created because they were able to move things around in their budgeting, for those districts that used ESSER to increase teacher salaries, that's going to result in some ongoing recurring costs. That's going to drive a fiscal challenge going forward. Now, of course, to meet the moment of sky high inflation and increasing sort of demand from systems to raise teacher salaries, it is absolutely understandable that districts have had that pressure. And so the question going forward is, how much have we raised salaries and what do we really expect our recurring costs to be driven by increased salaries? To then be able to make moves, make strategic moves about what do we do in the short term, but also how do we revisit our compensation structure to really incentivize teacher leadership and to work to implement strategic compensation moves differently than we've done before. The other factor here, the third one, is increased staffing levels. What we're seeing is that in many systems, they used ESSER to bring on additional staff to meet the need, whether that was instructional coaches, paraprofessionals, aides in buildings, behavioral supports, attendance supports, and family navigators. So many districts are reporting about how their investments in additional staff have really enabled the system to achieve that level of recovery and redesign. And when ESSER one-time funds go away, those increased staffing levels are certainly going to create a fiscal challenge that districts are going to have to navigate, particularly in the face of declining enrollment. What we've seen in some systems where enrollment has gone down by 5-6%, staffing levels, not because they necessarily hired a whole lot of new teachers, they've just sort of maintained things at the status quo. Staffing levels have actually gone up per pupil because of that declining enrollment by a substantial amount. And so as districts are coming to terms with exactly what is our design for how we want to staff and resource our schools, what does it look like to create the student experiences that we really think students need, and what is the right combination of staffing to achieve that, it's really important to be understanding how these increases in teacher staffing levels are going to play out on a fiscal level, but also use this moment to redesign what that staffing level could be. Again, that sounds somewhat grandiose, like that's not an easy endeavor, but using these moments to build the understanding of here's what our staffing level looks like in the context of the declining enrollment and our changing budgets, building that collective understanding with a broad group of stakeholders within a district is so important to start to build toward those larger structural changes. The other factor here, number 4, is the amount of change in per pupil funding levels from state and local. In systems that haven't seen big increases in local or particularly state funding, many high poverty districts are actually more reliant on state funding than local. And so if state contexts have not been such that they're able to sort of meet the moment and work towards bridging that fiscal gap, that's going to be another important thing for districts to understand through longer term forecasting and really understanding about how do we expect our state funding formulas to be changing, particularly again in the context of declining enrollment. The fifth one here around fund balance is a really interesting one. What we've heard from many districts, and some state education agencies have been really proactive about actually advocating for this as a strategy to try to smooth the potential fiscal cliff, is how districts can use their fund balance. Now, states and localities have different rules about exactly how much can you bank of your general operating fund as a fund balance to carry forward into the next year. And so, of course, this very much depends. And so for districts and states that do have limits to what that could be or don't allow that at all, that's going to reduce the opportunity for that district to sort of smooth the cliff. Because if a district has been able to sort of bank a little bit more of their fund balance because of the flexibility that ESSER has enabled, then that's a really great strategy to achieve that third scenario of a really nice iceberg that blends right back down into the ground instead of a really steep cliff. So this is one that states should be looking at. It's a potential lever around policies there, but also that districts can sort of be tracking and then thinking longer term, what are the ways that we actually want to use that fund balance over the course of the next few years? The last one, which maybe becomes less and less relevant or more relevant every day as we push towards the September 30th liquidation or obligation deadline for ESSER funds, is just how much unspent ESSER is there left in a district. It's really important to be tracking that, right? I think, no district wants to leave money on the table. And what are districts sort of able to spend it on and that are still strategic and do not create a potential recurring cost? Those options get fewer and fewer as we get closer to that end goal. And so districts that still have significant amounts of resources left to spend, that's going to create an additional complexity for them. I think what we're hearing from many districts is that doesn't feel like as pressing a challenge. Most districts feel really good about the plans that they have in place to spend down. And we'll hear a little bit more about some of the flexibilities there. But I think this is an important thing that districts really should be tracking to make sure, not only just to make sure they've spent down, but as part of the understanding about what are we spending our resources on and how do we ensure that they're really being used effectively. Now, when you look at the combination of those factors and you sort of roll things up, it's apparent that districts and states will face differing levels of challenges. And so, really appropriate that we're here today, sharing space with Southern Education Foundation and hopefully many district leaders in the room who come from Southern districts and Southern states. Because what we're finding is that many states, for example, Mississippi and Louisiana, where there is a large majority of the districts are serving students living in poverty, and they sort of received ESSER was a large proportion of their baseline funding levels. There is going to be a rather acute challenge that these districts might face, and there might be larger challenges that they're going to need support from their state education agencies on how exactly do we navigate this and getting guidance to know how to support it. As I sort of said before, depending on baseline funding levels, ESSER funds can account from anywhere from 4% to 17% in total education revenue if you were to evenly split it over 3 years. And so really getting that clarity of like, what was ESSER as a portion of our resources, and how do we need to sort of account for this is going to be really important. To sort of hit that point a little bit more finely, the factors that we are looking at here when we think about what makes up the nature of a state's risk are these three things that you see here on the left. They have the highest ratio of federal funds to overall education spending, meaning like baseline spending and education is fairly low, and so ESSER reflected a large proportion on top of that. The second factor here is they have the largest share of students who attend a school in a high poverty district. And then lastly is just like the number of districts that are serving a high proportion of students experiencing poverty. So those last two really speak to the level of challenge that a SEA might have in really being able to address all of the needs of many different district leaders who are struggling with unique circumstances, being able to provide that broad level of support while also then thinking about the actual just fiscal challenges around how do we increase our funding? Is that possible? What would it mean to adjust our state funding formulas? Create a pretty pressing challenge. And so the states that sort of meet the risk criteria from our analysis, and we'll share that link explaining how we did that towards the end, but those states are sort of listed there in the middle. And that's just, our high level assessment. We're not sort of, this is just a nature of the demographics and the populations that these states are serving. And so, but really important to think about how do we offer supports to districts serving students in these states.
Great. So I'm going to chime in here just for a few slides. Hassan mentioned earlier that this is the idea of cutting budgets is not new in K-12. A lot of districts have been here before. And if history tells us anything about the way that districts approach budget reduction, it is commonly through what we call the rollover and cut approach. The way it works is a district carries over its existing budget to the next year, and then makes across-the-board cuts in order to shrink the budget just a little bit, just enough so that it fits within the new revenue target. So this might look like a superintendent telling every department in central office, you must reduce your budget by 5%. Or it might look like just sort of bringing down school funding levels by the same amount for every school. The challenge with this approach is that it really effectively locks in the status quo service delivery models that are in schools. So you're not doing anything new. You're certainly not reallocating to try and stand up some sort of new strategy. And really what you're doing is you're just sort of making it harder to do even the basics. We like to say you're really doing less with less. It is also very easy politically to do this. It doesn't require you to make tough decisions that disproportionately impact specific schools or departments. So we understand why districts do it, but at the end of the day, you're not going to get to sort of a new vision or be able to sustain high impact strategies simply by carrying over the budget and just shrinking it enough to meet your revenue target. There are some districts out there that have explored this idea of zero-based budgeting. Zero-based budgeting is the idea that you throw out everything and you say, we're going to build our budget up from scratch. So nothing's assumed to be in there. We're just going to start with like, what do we actually need in a school, or what do we need in our central office? There's certainly some merit to that. I think we would say that it has a spirit of transformation, that it intends to kind of disrupt the status quo by saying, like, we really want to start from a blank slate. The challenge there is that it is often very, very disruptive, that you can often inadvertently sort of throw out investments or systems that have taken years and years to stand up. So unless you're in a place where you're really able to manage that level of disruption, it can be sort of challenging. We've started conceiving of this idea that we call a design-first approach. And a few months ago, I was in a room with a bunch of CFOs kind of talking about like the limitations of those two approaches that I just described. The design-first approach is really thinking about like, what are the service delivery models that we want to be true in schools? Like, what are we actually trying to do here? Is it high dosage tutoring? Is it targeted interventions or class size reductions for our highest need kids? Is it retention bonuses for our in order to help attract and retain our math and special ed teachers? Whatever it is, starting with an actual definition of like, what are the sort of big rocks and what do we need to design in order to deliver a high quality experience for students? And then building a budget around that. What's different with this approach than a zero-based approach is that it's not something you do all at once. You may actually have to, over a series of years, actually work towards that new budget. You might say like, well, we need high dosage tutoring for 15% of our kids in every school. It might take some time to actually be able to reorganize and reallocate resources towards that. But what we do want to discourage as much as possible in this budget season is just carrying over what we've been doing, because in a lot of cases, what we've been doing has not been delivering the outcomes that we're seeking. San, do you want to go to the next slide? This year in particular, there is a lot of urgency around financial sustainability. I don't think this is lost on most people on this Zoom, that the expiration of the ESSER funding, and as Hassan mentioned a moment ago, in some cases the lack of funding carry forward means that there are at least a lot of districts that are kind of scrambling to figure out how do we get to next year. And as you can tell, it's February of 2024, so the window is really closing quickly on being able to make those decisions wisely. A few of the things that we're thinking about for this year, for those of you who might find yourself a little bit behind, as I think a lot of districts are, that, yes, the budget season is underway, but it might be difficult to actually see line of sight to a balanced budget for the end of the year. is that we think there's kind of 5 things that are particularly important for this district budget cycle as we're thinking about our sustainability plans. One is really, really carefully monitoring spend this year. So a lot of districts do this, and this year in particular, it is more important. What that means is actually tracking throughout the year, how are we spending against our budget? If we had unforeseen vacancies, how is that affecting the amount that we think we're going to end up spending by the end of the year? The reason this is so important this year is because every dollar that we don't spend, in many cases, has some implication for the dollars that we have available next year when we know we'll be in a more resource-constrained environment. So for districts that can actually carry forward dollars, knowing that you're going to have some underspend can be helpful in actually sort of beefing up your rainy day fund so that you can actually smooth the transition post ESSER into FY25. Summarizing and evaluating ESSER investments with the best available data. Hassan spoke to this a moment ago, but there is a lot of scrutiny right now over how public education dollars are being spent. There is a very reductive high-level view of it that says we spent $190 billion on education. Where are the results? We at ERS think, of course, that there's a lot to point to that's successful. Some of those things may not be easy to link directly to increases in literacy or in math scores, though, as Hassan mentioned, the new data coming out about that actually is promising, at least in certain areas. But more than ever, we do need to be able to kind of like summarize, evaluate, and tell the story of like, what did we do with our ESSER dollars? How was this useful? What impact did it make, even if that impact was on improving systems or things that might not be as easy to measure through student learning outcomes. Quantifying savings or reallocation options. Again, for those districts that are really up against the ropes, are really trying to figure out how do we make it to next year? How do we get to a balanced budget? Really taking a critical lens to the existing budget and thinking where are the places where we can pull resources that don't disrupt learning, that are aligned with our strategy. In some cases, even identifying areas where we need to increase our spending by digging even deeper into our existing budget and thinking about those reallocation options. There's a lot of districts out there I know that are kind of going through this blitz style sort of reallocation exercise with their cabinet to make sure there's some consensus on like where are the places where we're going to pull dollars, given that a lot of the ESSER funding is going away. Building a multi-year financial forecast. We think this is best practice generally, but especially as we're trying to balance funding across this very disruptive set of years where ESSER is going away. In some cases, state funding models are changing, teacher compensation is going up. It's really important to have some visibility into what the long-term or the sort of multi-year fiscal outlook looks like. That also can help district leaders think about like, for our fund balance, where do we want to apply that? How much do we need to apply next year and the year after? What does that mean about the decisions we need to make more quickly? What kind of what runway do we actually have to make effective decisions about our budget? And then lastly, maximizing revenue. This one's kind of a no-brainer. If you can increase revenue, absolutely, you should. There are a few things that we've seen, and ERS, we're not as much experts on the revenue side of things, but we do talk with a lot of CFOs and financial leaders and policy experts who are more well-versed in this. There are a lot of options out there for maximizing federal reimbursements, thinking about opportunities through the Inflation Reduction Act, really going hard after grants or philanthropic dollars that may be expiring soon. and also thinking about fund balance again as sort of a strategy for increasing revenue next year. So I think we would just leave you off with this one saying really important to explore all your options now. I know some district leaders who, in prior years, they've left Medicaid reimbursement dollars on the table with good reason. The reporting requirements are daunting. It's really hard and time consuming. This might be the time to actually see if you can get more out of that, or think about sort of other opportunities you have on the revenue side. Hassan, I think I'm going to skip over this next one because I talked through most of that, and then I think I'm handing it back to you.
Yep, I'll take that. I think you definitely talked through a lot about why, in this particular moment, these moves are maybe more important than ever. I want to dig a little bit deeper into one of the things that you talked about, Joe, which was what does it look like to be thinking about evaluating ESSER investments? Coming into this FY25 budget process, district leaders are making tough decisions about what are we going to sustain, what are the initiatives that are worth it, and what are those that we can ramp down. And in order to make those decisions grounded in a true understanding of outcomes and success, we're hearing more and more districts applying this system strategy return on investment. Education is not a business. We're not in the business of ROI. But there is something to think about. What is the return on academic outcomes? How do we think about when we are defining an initiative? Are we understanding the core need that we're trying to address? Are we considering a broad range of strategies? Is it within the day tutoring? Is it after school tutoring? Is it virtual or in person? How are we exploring different strategies here? And then for whatever we pick, articulating a logic model that says, here are the inputs that we're giving as a system or as a teacher or as a school leader, and here are the things that we expect, here are the outputs that we expect from our actions, and then here are the outcomes that we eventually expect from those outputs. Are we fully understanding the cost, including one-time upfront costs now and also costs over time built on increasing recurring costs? Are there ways to do this more cost effectively, or to Joe's point, to leverage other funding sources? And then are we really defining our metrics for evaluating success? How do we know if we're implementing it and if we're seeing the changes that we expect to see? And how are we orienting as a system to actually measure it? And so this system strategy return on investment approach that really lays out what are we doing for each investment, in an ideal world for many of our investments in districts, program directors or district leaders are sort of coming up and defining these theories of action or these logic models for all of their investments that make sense to, that then enables teams to sort of pull up and say, yeah, this initiative is really working. And if it's not working, is it because we can tweak implementation, or is it because it's actually not the right fit for what we're trying to accomplish, or the core need has changed, or when we established this core need a decade ago, because it's a program that's been around us forever, maybe things have changed since. And it's really important, especially in the ESSER context, that systems aren't just waiting for those outcome metrics. Like we read the NAEP report and we're like, we're not seeing academic returns, like things aren't working. And to Joe's point, like there are bright spots there. There are things that are working. And so not relying only on those outcome measures to say this is whether or not a system is this initiative is working or not is so important. Not only because it helps us communicate impact of like, you're saying, we're not seeing the changes, but like actually we have really strong leading indicator data or really strong implementation data that says this is working. But it's also about the district leaders being able to really understand what is or is not working and implement those changes. And so tracking implementation metrics across a range of things like fidelity. Are we actually doing the things that we said we were going to do? We said we were going to do high dosage tutoring twice a week. How often is tutoring actually happening? Let's look at uptake. Are students actually opting in if we had an opt-in program? Let's look at access and equity. Which of our students have access to this initiative? Is it being targeted towards our highest need students or our students most in need of this particular investment? Then looking at leading indicators. So if it's a proven research-backed initiative, well, what does the research tell us about what the indicators should be? Are there interim progress measures that we can be looking at? How are we sort of evaluating satisfaction or identifying, even if they're anecdotal, but identifying bright spots of where this is going well? And then eventually, of course, understanding the impact on proficiency and growth and other long-term academic and other student experience outcomes. But relying just on those outcome measures, particularly in this moment, really makes it challenging to understand what's working, but also to meet the moment and saying, here are all the great things that we've actually been able to accomplish with our ESSER funds, and here's why we need more resources. Um, Speaking of more resources, I want to make sure we save time for our friends at EAC and OBC, but I want to just share one more slide that sort of captures some of the many resources that we talked about today. I think these slides will be shared back out, and if you visit erstrategies.org, you can find a number of these. But there's a wealth of resources, and so many districts all grappling with these same challenges, trying to understand how do we meet this moment of sustainability planning? How do we use our existing resources as effectively as possible while also planning for the long term? So hopefully some of these resources can be beneficial for folks. And I think I'll pause there, and I'll pass it off to Jasmine.
Thanks, Hassan. And Terry, I did want to make sure that we did address your question. You asked a question about the ESSER liquidation extension, so we did want to share some information about that. It is an additional lever that you can consider as you plan. So what's still true about it is that funds must be obligated by September 30th, 2024 and liquidated by January 30th, 2025. Under the liquidation extension of up to 14 additional months, so that'll be totaling about 18 months. If approved by the U.S. Department of Education, you will have additional time to carry out those contracts or other properly made obligations for allowable activities when those obligations were made on or before the statutory deadline of September 30th, 2024. So what's new? The application is now available. In particular, the Department of Ed encourages grantees to highlight investments in 3 of the evidence-based strategies that can significantly contribute to improved student performance, which they named as increasing daily student attendance, providing high-quality tutoring, and increasing access to before, after summer learning and extended learning time. SEAs are encouraged to apply by December 31st, 2024. And I'm going to share a couple of resources in the chat right now for you to explore further. So with that being said, I'll hand it over to Ishay.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. Make sure I have. Thank you so much, Jasmine, Joe, and Hassan. I am Ishay Collins, and I serve as the director of the Equity Assistance Center South at the Southern Education Foundation. So just give me 1 second. And so with the wealth of information shared by Joe and Hassan, the Equity Assistance Center is available to help you further. And so just wanted to go through, who are we? We are one of the 4 Equity Assistance Centers in the nation, funded by the U.S. Department of Education, which serves our public education systems by addressing issues of equity. We are here to advise, assist, and serve public schools and districts in your work to provide more equitable opportunities for students in the areas of race, national origin, sex, and religion as required by law. And so we serve Region 2, which supports 11 states in the South. Those states are Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Virginia, and the District of Columbia. And so if you are in one of these states, we would love to connect and assist you. So we provide a range of technical assistance and training to school districts and agencies at no cost to you. Again, at no cost, as we're talking about funds and really maximizing our district funds. This is at no cost to you. And so the tiers that you see on the slide are the range of technical assistance that we provide, that goes from our universal technical assistance, which is for everyone, such as webinars like this one. We develop toolkits, reports, and more, to a more intimate district level support that you may need through our intensive level of technical assistance. And so if you would like to inquire about our services, you can visit our website. And here on this slide, we have I have a copy for you of our assistance form, and how the first step is to submit a request for assistance. And as you complete this form, please provide as much information as you can, such as letting us know what the issue is that you're experiencing, what is the desired outcome you would like to see, and more. And so you can access this form on our website, or send us an email to connect further. We're putting the information in the chat, as well as you can see our website at www.exsouth.org, or send an email at exsouth@southern.org. And once we receive your request, we'll be in touch with you to follow up. And so we look forward to hearing from you and the opportunity to assist you. And so thank you again. I will now pass it back to Jasmine with outcomes-based contracting.
All righty, thank you, Ishay. So one strategy for districts to consider as they begin planning for post-ESSER is outcome-based contracting. And I'm having difficulty here. Thank you. All right, so outcomes-based contracting, also known as OBC, requires that a substantial part of provider payment is contingent on meeting agreed upon outcomes. It guarantees that public dollars will deliver impact by directly linking expenditure of school district resources to improving student outcomes. It requires a partnership between district and providers where they identify and commit to clearly defined outcomes. OBC empowers districts to contract for clear student outcomes and compels mutual accountability for achieving them, which is a shift from the traditional way that we've done contracting. OBC requires a shift in mindset from how much does it cost to how much is it worth, meaning how much are you willing to pay for a year's worth of growth, or how much are you willing to pay for a student moving a proficiency level. At OBC, we like to say, we don't buy services, we buy outcomes. Take a moment and look at the comparison between traditional contracting and outcomes-based contracting. What is standing out to you regarding this shift? Let me know in the chat. All right, I don't see anyone saying anything, but I'll point out a few things for you. Historically, districts have paid providers for delivering services independent to whether or not that service leads to better outcomes for students, meaning the district is taking on all the risk. You pay regardless of the results. That's one of the main shifts that you'll notice as you look at this model, shifting from traditional contracting to outcomes-based contracting. And OBC, rather than just paying for services rendered, a portion of the payment, which we like to typically say 40%, is contingent upon whether students achieve those outcomes. So where did our work begin? While outcomes-based contracting has occurred in other industries, this work is fairly new to education, particularly for meeting academic outcomes. Before moving to the Southern Education Foundation, before launching our first group of districts, there was a year-long feasibility project conducted out of the Center of Education, Policy Research at Harvard University. We launched work in districts in 2021, and we are now in 13 districts across the country. We are a nonprofit organization and are funded by philanthropy. Out of the feasibility work and the subsequent pilot, district leaders, myself at the time included, have worked on meeting these goals. I'd like to call your attention to the final bullet that you see there. With ESSER funding coming to an end, one of the reasons I believe OBC is a promising practice is that it has the potential to put pressure on the current price of instructional interventions and ensure sustainability of funding streams. And yes, I see, Alan, you put something in the chat. The whole idea that results are somewhat guaranteed through OBC seems to be a whole shift. It definitely is. So for more information about outcomes-based contracting or future opportunities, please visit our website. We'll drop our website in the chat. We offer a range of tools and resources, as well as access to learning opportunities, such as our annual convening, technical assistance, and cohort experience. We're dropping that in the chat for you now. Before we wrap up this session, this webinar, we're excited to invite you to participate. We're eager to hear your questions and thoughts on today's topic. Please use the chat to ask your questions and share any thoughts. All right. Well, we will stick around for a few moments just in case anyone has any additional questions that have come up. Otherwise, our webinar is adjourned. Thank you, Faith. We look forward to hearing from you. We've dropped the link to a survey in the chat. So if you would please share your feedback with us. We'll drop that link again just in case you missed it.